Hi everyone, and welcome to this video. In this video, we're going to be talking about the concept of authentication, and we're going to specifically be talking about token-based authentication in the Django REST framework. Now, authentication provides for us a way in which we can identify a request. And by this, I mean actually every request that we create in the Django REST framework is identified by two things. It is identified by the user who created it and the token that signed it. Now in this video, we're going to be looking at how we can set up token-based authentication for us to protect our protected endpoint, so that we require to log in and get an access token that will give us access in our authorization headers. So to get started, I'm going to go within our simple blog folder right here, and within our settings.py, I'm going to begin by installing our Auth token app that comes inbuilt with Django REST Framework. So to do that, I'll go right here, and after REST Framework, I'll go ahead and add the REST Framework Auth token app. And right after adding this, I'm also going to go ahead and add our default authentication classes. So these default authentication classes allow us to define which kind of authentication we're going to be using in our Django REST framework. Now I'm going to go to our REST framework settings, and that is a setting we actually set. The first key was the non-fields error key. So I'm going to add another setting within our REST framework settings. So I'll give in the key, and the key will be default authentication classes. And then this will be an iterable containing the various authentication classes. So in this case, we shall begin by providing the first authentication class. So all these are within the authentication module in Django REST framework. So to get access to them, I'll first come and say REST framework dot authentication. Then in this case, we're going to begin by providing the session authentication. This can work if we need session authentication. And I'm also going to add the token authentication class. So this is going to be REST framework dot authentication dot, in this case it will be token authentication. Now that we've been able to do this, we can also be able to add, in case let's say we are using another application, an external application to do our authentication, we can actually come and add the authentication class of that specific app or that specific package into our authentication classes. Now I'm also going to set the default permission classes, and we're going to look into that in a second. So actually, let me try to do it right now. So I'll just come right here and set the key. So our key is going to be default. So this will be default permission classes. And in this case, it will also be an iterable containing the class, the default permission class that's going to actually allow us to have a permission to access a certain endpoint. So in this case, what I'll start with is REST framework dot, in this case, we shall access the permission, and then we shall access the is authenticated permission. Now, if you're confused about this, I will make a separate video explaining permissions in detail. But what this permission does is to only allow us access to a protected endpoint, and this is only to happen if we are authenticated. So I'm going to go ahead and save. Now, after saving here, we're going to need a way of creating a token. So Django REST framework provides for us a token model that basically creates a token, and this token is to be associated with a single user. So for us to be able to do this at signing up, what we're going to do is to go within the serializer we created when signing up a user and maybe set that up. Another approach can be creating a signal that listens for a user creation and then goes ahead and creates a token for that specific user. So what I'll do is to go within our accounts app, and then within our accounts app, I'm going to go to serializers.py, Now in here, we define this create method that's to be able to set for us a password when creating our user. Now, another thing we're going to do is to create a token for that specific user we have been created. Now, this token is unique and it is only specific to a given user. So each of the users that sign in into our application have a different token. So what I'll go ahead and do is to import our token model. Now remember, we installed our Auth token app, and that provides for us the model for our tokens. So I'm going to come right here and I'll start by importing a model. So I'll say from REST Framework .auth token. In this case, we shall actually access the models module, and then we shall go ahead and access our token. Now, right after accessing our token, we're going to go within our create method and then create a token that belongs to that specific user we've created. So to do that, after saving our user, we shall also create a token for that user. So I'll just come and say token.object.create, and then in this case, we shall have our user being equal to our user, and then this is going to go ahead and create a token specific to that specific user we've created that sign up. So I'll go ahead and save. Now when I save, we actually see we have 3 unapplied migrations. Now these unapplied migrations are actually migrations that are specific to our Auth token app, and they need to be included because we are going to be using the model for tokens, and it's going to help us to create tokens and associate them to our users. So I'll Control C, and then I'll run Python money.py migrate, and this is going to go ahead and migrate our models. So after doing that, I'll run our server again. Now let us go ahead and basically see what a request is when we are carrying out our authentication. So to do that, I'm simply going to go within our views, accounts app. We created a route or a URL that's specific to our signing up. Now the next URL we're going to be creating is one that's going to be specific to our logging in. So what I'm going to do is to create a class, and this class is going to be our login view. So this is going to be a simple API view. We're not going to deal with a generic API view. So what I'll come and do is to import it. So I'll just come and say from, this is going to be REST Framework .views. We are going to import our API view. And right after importing our API view, I'm simply going to come within our login view, and then I'll provide our API view. So our login view is going to inherit from our API view. So that means we can be able to access the different HTTP methods. So I'll just come and define our post method, which will take in self. It will also take in a request object that's going to be of type request. Now, one of the beauties of using type hints is you get access to the various methods of that specific parameter you pass into a function. For example, when I specify that this is of type request, I can be able to come and say request dot, and then I'll be able to access all the various attributes that the request object has. Now, away from that, I'll just pass this for now. Now, let's try to explore a request when carrying out authentication. So to do that, I'll just simply create a simple get request, and this is going to have self and then request. Then this is going to be of type request. Oh, sorry for this. So this is going to be of type request, and then here we're going to create content, which is going to be a dictionary. This dictionary is going to have the 2 attributes that are necessary for an authenticated request. So it's going to have the user, and they will access the user who actually sent this request is through request.user. Now, request.user is a user object that's returned in case we want to access the user who actually made this request. So for us to be able to access it and send it through our JSON, we shall need to return a string version of that, or a string representation. Now we shall just come and say that we shall return a string of request.user. So this will actually return the unique identifier for that user, and to show us the user who actually made that request. Another thing is the token. Now that token is accessed via request.auth. and this will actually be our content. So let us try to return a response that's going to show us the nature of our data that comes within our request, or the data identifying that specific request. So to do that, I'll just simply come here and return. We shall have our response, and this response will have data. So this data is going to be our content, and then we shall actually have a status code. So in this case, our status code is going to be equal to status dot, in this case shall have HTTP, and this will be 200. Okay, all right, now that we have this, let us go ahead and try to make URL that's going to allow us to access our login endpoint. So I'll go to our urls.py within our accounts app, and then I'm going to add another URL pattern. So this is going to be our path. So in this case, I'll just come right here and add path. So this is actually going to be path. And the first thing it's going to take in is going to be the URL, which is going to be on our /login. Then you shall take in the view. So in this case, it's going to be views.login view. So since this is a class-based view, we shall call that .asv function. Then we shall give it a name. This name is going to be login. Alright, so now that this is done, let us head over to our Insomnia and be able to carry out our request. Alright, so right here in our Insomnia, we're going to begin by investigating what our request is going to have. So I'll begin by creating a new request, and this will be our login get request. So once I've done with this, then I'll create this request, and then I'll go ahead and specify our URL to be localhost 8000, then /auth/login. So when I send this request, we now see that's going to return the following data about the request. Now, each time we are not authenticated, we expect that our user is going to be an anonymous user object, and then we are not going to also have a token returned to us. So this actually happens like in a way where we are authenticated, we can be able to access the user object of the user who is currently authenticated, as well as their token. Now let us go ahead and handle the login endpoint, or the login functionality. So to do that, I'll simply go within our code, and here in our post request, I'm going to begin by accessing our email. So our email is going to be equal to, so in this case we shall access the request data, so access that via the request.data. Then I'll call the .get method, and then I'll access the email, and then I'll do the same thing for our password. So I'll say that our password is going to be equal to our request data. So this is going to be data, then we shall get the password. And right now, we shall need a way of basically returning a user object, or checking for the user object that contains those credentials. Now we're going to use the authenticate function, or the authenticate method that comes from Django. So I'm going to go ahead and import this. So I'll just come and say from Django.contrib.auth, I'm going to go ahead and import the authenticate function. And right after importing our authenticate function, I'll simply come right here and say that we're going to have our user be equal to authenticate. Then here we're going to provide our email, which will be our email. We shall also provide our password, which will be our password. Now, after doing this, we are going to check if this user exists. So we shall do if user, and in this case, you can say if user is not none, then we can actually return a response containing our token. So I'm just going to come right here and say shall return a response. Now I can just simply come in here and say that shall have our response. Now this response is going to have a message. So let's just say that our login was successful. And then we can also have our token. So since each user is associated to a token, we are simply going to go ahead and return a token for that specific user. So in this case, what I have to do is to return a token. and then we shall access the user token. So to do that, we shall come and say user, and in this case we're going to access auth token, which will be the token associated to the user or the token object. Then we shall get the string representation of the key, and that's accessed via the key attribute. So we shall just come right here and say that we are returning our data, and this data is going to be equal to our response. And then the next thing we're going to do is status. So our status in this case is going to be status.http 200. Okay. And then in case our user does not exist, so we shall say else. In this case, we are going to return our response, and our response is going to be equal to data, which is going to have a message of invalid username. It's actually going to be invalid email or password. So let us try to create a new user who has a token. I'm going to go right here in Insomnia, and I'll go where I create a user account. So I created the user, but I'm going to change this user. So let's say we are going to call this user John Doe, and then we can also have this user as John Doe. We're going to keep the password the same. So right now we see that our user has been created successfully. Now I'm going to come and create a new request, which is going to be for logging in a user. Now this is going to be a post request, and shall have a body. So this body is going to be JSON. Shall create this request, so it's going to be at localhost 8000. Then we shall access /auth and /login. So we shall need to provide the body. This body is going to have an email, and this email is going to be johndoe@app.com. Then we shall also need our password. So our password in this case is going to be password 123. And when we send this request, in this case we see that our login has been successful, and we are being returned a token. Now let us try to access some of the endpoints that are created. So when we go to the endpoint for getting all our posts for now, when you send this request, we actually see that we do not have a permissions set. So to do that, we are going to go back to our views for our posts, and within our post views, we are going to access the view for returning all our posts. So right within our post list create view, I'm simply going to add a permission classes list, and this is going to be a list of permission classes. Now I'm going to begin by importing the .isAuthenticated permission, which is going to allow this to be accessed only and only when we are authenticated. So to do that, I'll just simply come within our request here, or within our imports, and then say from REST Framework .permissions, we are going to go ahead and import our isAuthenticated. Now we can have other permissions. As I said, I'll create a separate video for explaining permissions. We need to go ahead and save. So when you head over to our post list create view, I'm simply going to come and add our isAuthenticated permission. So when I go ahead and save, when you go back this side and try to make this request again, we now see that our authentication credentials were not provided. So the next thing we're going to do is try to figure out a way of accessing this endpoint by providing our token in our authorization headers. So I'm going to go to our headers right here. Now if you're wondering what headers are, this is just information about the request that's sent with the request. So I'm just going to come here and create an authorization header, and then within here, when we're using token authentication, we shall be providing the token as well as the value of the token. So I'm going to go where I created our token when logging in a user. I'll copy this token right here. And within where we actually want to get all posts, I'll just come and paste in the token. And when I send this request, we now see that we currently don't have any posts. So let us try to create some posts within our database. So when I go where we actually have an endpoint for creating a new post, when I try to send posts, we now see authentication credentials weren't provided, but for us to access that, we shall just come and say that we're going to have our authorization. And in this case, we shall have token. It's going to be token, and then we shall paste in the token. And in this case, we see that we've been able to create some posts successfully. So even when you try to get all posts for now, we can be able to have a list of posts. So in this video, actually before I wind up this video, I'd like to show you what an authenticated request is. So when you go back to where we actually investigate our request, I can provide our authorization credentials here. Just come and create a header for authorization and then provide our value as token and then paste in our token. So when I send this, we actually see the user who sent this request as well as the token that sent that request. This is awesome. So in this video, I've been able to cover token-based authentication using the Django REST Framework. I hope you've learned from this video. If you've learned from this video, please leave a like. And if it's your first time to come to my channel, my name is Ali Jonathan. I create videos on programming and related topics. Please subscribe to the channel if you're new. Thank you for watching and see you in the next video. Bye.